Gentlemen, good morning all. I believe it is the appointed hour, and if I may, will start the proceedings. And if I could say how lovely it is to see people there in the flesh. I know it's rather like an examination room, but it is lovely to see you here in the flesh. So much better to have these meetings when we can all be together. I've got a few housekeeping points to start with, if I may. You will have observed that we have a PA system working. And for those of you that speak, basically, if you can hear yourself coming through the loudspeakers, everything's probably working all right. But if you would like to speak, could you please, if you don't have a microphone in front of you, raise a hand. I know it means we lose a bit of spontaneity. Raise a hand so we can get a roving microphone to you. And then we'll be able to capture the sound properly. It's not so that it isn't that we can't hear each other. It is very important because, as you know, this is being broadcast. Now, before I go on, I just would like to recap the basis of our being here, which is about our COVID protocol. We have already asked that all those attending undertake a lateral flow test, so thank you for that. Quite clearly, the fact that you're all here means that none of you have any symptoms of infection, and I'm delighted to hear that. And of course, it's very encouraging to know how Warwickshire is one of the leading parts of the south of England in terms of its take-up of vaccinations on offer. So well done, Warwickshire. You aren't obliged to wear face masks here seated because we have 2 meter spacing, but when you leave the building and are moving around, we would ask please that you put your face masks back on again. We know who you all are and we have contact details, so that enables us to operate a track and trace system. Those of you who haven't been here before, we're going to leave those doors open. I hope it's all right to leave those doors open with everyone. It means there's a bit more air circulating. And there aren't any fire drills practiced. If we should have to exit, then there's that way, that way, that way, and I think we can open this one as well. There's plenty of ways of getting out. That, I think, unless I've missed something, is all of the housekeeping points. Does that sound about right? But if I could thank our friends from Sound and Vision for being here and providing all these wonderful facilities, thank you very much. I hope we don't cause you too much problem. There is one more housekeeping point. If you have mobile phones, could you please turn them off or set them to aeroplane mode so that it doesn't interfere with all the other signals that are going around. Is everyone happy that we have a safe and secure environment? Good. So if we could go on to the agenda. Firstly, I would like to welcome some new members to this committee. Councillor Sarah Feeney. Hi, we've said hello already. Councillor Brian Hammersley, we've also said hi. And Councillor Christopher Kettle. Hi. Thank you all for coming. And we look forward to your further contributions. And of course, perhaps, and it does appear in the annual report, I think this is a point in time that we should thank those councillors that have served this committee very well over the years but are no longer with us, and be thanked for their contributions. As you will all notice, there are quite a few bits of paper to read for this meeting, so it is no easy ride. We have an apology from Barnaby Briggs from the Fire and Rescue Service. I don't believe there's anyone else. Members' disclosures of pecuniary and non-pecuniary interests. You've all seen the papers. Is there any interest someone would like to declare? Councillor Kettle. Hand being raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very minor, but I used to be an employee of Grant Thornton many years ago, although I was never a member of the audit department.
Thank you for that. Are there any other Declarations of interest? No. We will move on then to the minutes of our last meeting, which you will recall was electronic. It was on Thursday the 25th of March. Is everyone who it is said was here, do they all agree they were here? And everyone who wasn't here agreed they weren't? Is there anything that anyone would like to comment on in terms of accuracy? I'm not going to do it page by page. I'll ask for that en bloc. No? Thank you. Right. I will sign those at the end of the meeting. Now, in terms of matters arising, I believe that all the points that we would want to come back to are on the agenda. But is there anything that anyone feels we talked about last time which should re-emerge and be talked about as a matter arising? Nothing? Good. There is a question I noted. Where do we stand with the member code of conduct now? Sarah, can you speak to that? I think you have a mic.
Yes, thanks, Chair. The proposed revisions that were approved by the Audit and Standards Committee at its last meeting went forward to Cabinet and were endorsed there, and they're going forward to the next full Council, Chair, which is in July.
Good, thank you. There being no other matters arising, we're going to move on, which takes us to item number 2, which is the audit plan for Warwickshire County Council for the year which has just passed. Ron Thornton, thank you very much for coming along. John, hi, good to see you. Would one of you like to lead on this and introduce the item before we move on? Hand? Thank you. Can't quite hear you. Could you go a bit closer to the mic?
Or the year ended 31st of March 2021. So as you've said, Chair, it's for the year that has ended. We will shortly be starting our final accounts work once the draft accounts have been fully prepared. As always with these plans, there is a good deal of boilerplate text in there, things that we have to say to you in order to comply with auditing standards. You'll be pleased to know I don't propose going through all of that in any great detail. Just to draw out a few things for you, the levels of materiality and the significant risks that we've identified are broadly consistent with previous years, so no great change there. You'll notice that there is quite a lot in the plan about accounting estimates. There is a new auditing standard rather on accounting estimates this year, which requires us to do additional work around that, particularly around the assumptions that underlie the accounting estimates, and also whether management have actually considered other possible ways of calculating the estimates and so on and so forth. So that's something we will be particularly taking into account in our work on things like the pensions liability and PPE valuations and provisions and so on. In terms of the value for money conclusion, as has already been flagged to you previously, we are carrying out a new approach to the value for money conclusion this year. You'll have seen we flagged that up in the plan. At this stage, and this is really quite exceptional, but we think it's merited. We haven't actually identified any significant risks around value for money here. But under the new approach, we nevertheless have to do a sort of baseline commentary across all the different areas that are within the scope of the value for money conclusion. So that's essentially financial sustainability, governance arrangements, and also your arrangements for ensuring economy efficiency and effectiveness. So sort of how you manage service performance and how you benchmark yourselves and those sorts of things. So the results of that work will be reported to you in due course. I think the only other thing that I need to mention from the plan is the significant increase in fees, which is unfortunate, but members will be aware of the outcome of the Redmond review, which looked at the whole operation of external audit within local government, concluded essentially that fees were too low. The government has agreed to put in additional funding to local authorities in order to help pay for increases in funding, which are essentially to enable us to spend the time on the audits that is required now in order to meet the rapidly increasing expectations of our regulators within the FRC. So we have discussed those proposed fee increases with officers. I wouldn't say that they are happy, but they have agreed to go with them. But obviously, we're quite happy to discuss further at any point. I think that's probably all I need to say by way of introduction to the plan, Chair. But quite happy to take any comments or questions.
Thank you, John. Perhaps I should say for new members of our committee, we had a robust debate last time about the increase in fees. There is a significant amount of extra work, but it is worth noting that the fee level now, in spite of the dramatic increase, is still considerably less than it was many years ago under a different regime. So to put it in perspective, we're still getting excellent value for money. And I think the other thing to notice is that there is no doubt that there are areas of local government which should be subject to a higher level of scrutiny, and that is just what is happening as a result of this, and with our full agreement. So I'm going to offer it to the committee at this point in time, having read the audit plan, whether you have any questions or indeed points to make. Councillor Kettle, hand. Thank you.
Obviously, Mr. Chairman, I'm a newbie on this, so probably no, I need to read that. What slightly concerns me in the paper, and I fully understand things have moved forward hugely over the years in terms of audit planning, but the two things really. One is the lack of figures on which for us to have an understanding behind what the cash flows, what the cash movements, revenue, cost movements might be. So it's very difficult for me, coming in from the cold, to understand the scale of the issues being looked at here. In particular, on page 19 of our document, which is page 3, an overall deficit on dedicated schools grants, and there's a new statutory instrument requiring that is charged in a different way than might have been in the past. But have no idea whether this is in the hundreds of thousands, if this is the millions or the tens of millions. I have no visibility as to what the potential impact of that is.
If I could answer that question first before you come to your second point. Rob Powell, I wonder whether you'd just like to say a few words about the transparency of transactions like that for councillors at large.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, the budgets and the budget lines are set out in detail in other documents from the audit plan. So I wouldn't necessarily expect to see it in the audit plan that's set out in the budget resolution. The makeup of that is there. What you will see on the specific point, Councillor Kettle, is that the DSG deficit is material. So at the end of this year, I think from memory, and Andy will correct me if I've got this wrong, we're probably in the early double figures of millions of deficit, and we're having to put substantial sums aside to cover the deficit that we project over the MTFS. So it's probably the biggest financial risk facing the authority on the specific. But this isn't the document for a breakdown of the budget. This is a document about the audit plan, and the materiality levels are set against gross revenue spend, and that's set out in the paper. And so it's a normal percentage sort of figure. So the detail we can give you, it's a different document. But certainly the DSG deficit is the biggest headache we have financially.
Andrew, would you like to add to that, or is that all right? You don't want to add? Okay, thanks. Is that all right, Councillor Kettle? The information I suspect you want is available. You just have to ask for it, but it is not part of the scope of this particular bit of work, although it will be obviously included in the audit examination.
No, are we on?
Yes, you're still on.
No, I understand. I'm sure the information is available, but in actually putting forward a proposal to us as members to consider, which is what we are here, I think it would have been helpful if there were 1 or 2 signposts as to the scale of the figures about which we're talking. Yes, of course, they'll be available elsewhere in budgets, draft accounts, final accounts, whatever else it is. But the proposal we're looking at today it raises issues, but doesn't put any scale on them. And I think the second point, which really...
I think that's helpful. Maybe Grant Thornton could just have a think about that and bear it in mind if you want to make a little bit more clear what is the orders of magnitude of some of these sums of money which has made you to draw these conclusions in terms of areas where you want to work. So I think that was a helpful suggestion. Thank you.
The second point really follows on for that, and that is on page 23, 7 of the auditor's proposal. There is a specific reference at the bottom, or in the smaller type, to charging Audit and Standard Committee members with a number of tasks relating to methods about accounting estimates. And there is a significant amount of work subsequently on accounting estimates. But again, this is a specific responsibility that is being charged to us, and I have no idea of the scale of that responsibility, and therefore, whilst I have every confidence in the team at Warwickshire County Council, this bit stands outside the finance team because the finger is pointing at us, and I again have no idea of the scale. And with respect in these things, when members are pointed at these specific areas or appointed to look at these areas, there is an onus, particularly on those who've got experience in these matters, to take these things, very seriously. I have no idea of the scale or the figures about which we are talking. Therefore, I find this document unhelpful in that respect, because yes, there is everything in there that I would expect to see, but no supporting evidence to enable me to balance how I and the rest of us are supposed to roll out our responsibilities in that respect.
I think it's a very fair point, and I see nods. And again, I think I'd put that back to Grant Thornton. I think a side letter to your audit plan would be helpful, in which you help the members of our committee understand what are the orders of magnitude of the sums which you're asking us to specifically consider. And of course, it's page 23 of the pack at the bottom, which we're looking at here. John, do you want to respond?
Yes, I mean, to take the point about putting a few more figures in where we can, certainly we will do that, as long as it doesn't kind of get in the way of what we see as the main messages of the document. And I think it is useful to put that scale in. I mean, this particular section on the role of the Audit and Standards Committee as those charged with governance, this is part of the new requirements that came in under ISA 540 this year. And what I would suggest is that when the draft statement of accounts is actually presented to you, you may want to bear these points specifically in mind and kind of use them as a focus of your questioning to officers about how those estimates are made. But I mean, just to, I'm not quite sure whether this is to reassure members or to panic members. Actually, these estimates are the biggest numbers in the accounts. The most significant ones being the net pension liability, which is basically the best estimate of the future cost of paying Warwickshire pensioners versus the assets held by the fund, and that is a very, I don't know the number off the top. I don't know whether any officers do, but it's certainly a very large number. The other very significant estimate is around the value of property, plant and equipment in the accounts. There are others which will crop up as well, for example, around any provisions that are made in the accounts. Year-end accruals are an accounting estimate, although they tend to be less significant compared with some of those other numbers. So I hope that's kind of helpful. We are actually talking serious numbers here.
Yes, but since this is a national requirement, presumably you will be in touch with members of the Audit and Standards Committee to find out exactly to what extent they do understand some of these points that you're making.
I think it would be more a case of observing the meeting at which the draft accounts are discussed, Chair.
Okay. Andrew.
So I think there's a number of things to say. So firstly, we've still got to do some detailed induction around this particular committee and the roles and responsibilities that you've got. So these sort of areas we can take you through before you get to the point where you've got to scrutinise those, like the accounts when they come through. So we've got some plans that are emerging that will take you through that, if that's any comfort from that perspective. I think it's also incumbent on us as officers when we present the reports that the things that you're being asked or there's expectations on you to look at, they're set out clearly within those. So the ways in which we've gone about estimating some of the material figures within the accounts, we will need to set out so that you can then test the reasonableness of those. And we should be giving you sufficient information to allow you to test that reasonableness without you having to go off and do a huge amount of extra work. It should be fairly evident from what we're giving you as officers to make that as easy as we can for you. But the combination of those two should equip you by the time we get to the point where you've got to do this piece of work, that you're able to make a sensible judgment on whether we've done our job properly, effectively, if that's helpful.
Could you say a little bit more about what you mean exactly by we have some plans for? Will this be a training session? Will this be as part of one of our regular meetings?
The July date that was originally set for this committee has been changed to a training date. So in July, there'll be some training for this particular committee.
And it will incorporate the things which John Gregory has mentioned?
It will incorporate those things.
Okay.
Happy? Good. Thank you. Councillor Horner. Councillor Horner, could you raise your hand higher? Thank you. Higher. Stretch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I'm actually, having had a discussion about lack of figures, wanted to discuss figures on page 27. And it's really a question about materiality and the 1.5% of the budget that you consider, the level of sort of the frontier of materiality, or the 700,000, which is about 0.5%. What is the purpose of the materiality? Does that mean if you're out by 1.5% in balancing the books, it's okay? Or is it that you're looking at, something like 700, what was it? That's right, the 14 million. Is that if you get a problem of not being able to find the invoices for 14 million? I mean, how is it going to work?
It is, as I understand it, we have been here before, Councillor Horner. It is the level at which the external auditors believe they have to make a significant comment. There's a different level of materiality than point of view of external audit and what we're concerned with here in Warwickshire County Council. But there has to be a threshold, doesn't there, at which they will raise a serious concern or not. It seems like a lot of money, but that's because this is a big organisation. But it's the threshold of your critical comment, John. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to stress is that materiality is only a guide. It is not an absolute thing. And if we find something wrong, smaller than the materiality level, we may take a particularly dim view of it if it's, for example, in a more sensitive area. But yes, you're absolutely right, Chair. We have to sort of draw the line somewhere, otherwise we would be here permanently auditing you, and our audit fee would run into many thousands of pounds more than it already is. So that sort of level of materiality, somewhere in the range of sort of 1 to 2% of turnover, is fairly typically used across the audit profession. We actually have a sort of benchmark within the firm that for all of our larger audits, we never go above the 1.5%, whereas in some of our smaller audits, we do go up to 2%. So yeah, the level of materiality, it drives what we test and what we don't test. It also drives how many of each thing we test when we're sampling, and it also drives what we report to you and what actually has an impact on our opinion. So if we find an error that is above that level of materiality, we talk to management. Management refuse, for whatever reason, to adjust it, and I have to say that sort of thing is extremely rare in the world that I work in. Then we would be into potentially qualifying our opinion on the accounts. If we find errors that are both individually and cumulatively less than that materiality level, we will report them to you. You can decide whether or not you want to adjust them, but they are unlikely to have an impact on our opinion on the accounts. And then finally, we have what we call the level of triviality, which I know doesn't sound very, very trivial, but 5% of our overall headline materiality is the level at which we say, well, these things are just too small for us to even bother reporting to you as those charged with governance. But again, that's only a sort of, it's a rule of thumb. It's not a hard and fast rule. We will sometimes report smaller things if they are sensitive. So I hope that gives you some reassurance. It's not a straightforward concept, but it's a guide that we work to.
Thank you. Councillor Kettle.
I'm completely comfortable, Mr. Chairman, with the materiality issue and the 1.5%. Where I'm slightly less so is on the clearly trivial, which is on the same page. The figure of 700,000 is clearly defined as clearly trivial, but doesn't say about 4 lines up. It refers to whether individually or in aggregate. And what the paper doesn't say, whether that 700,000 is the total accumulated trivial errors. I'm sure there aren't any trivial errors, I hasten to add. But in the event there were some to be uncovered, clearly if there were a series of errors which each individually were below the threshold of 700, but cumulative were greater than, would we have any visibility of that? Not that I'm again suggesting there would be, but just as a matter of principle, whether that is something which the auditors would bring to our attention.
I think I'd ask Rob Powell as to the extent to which he'd react to it. Sorry, could you lift your hand up, Rob? Thanks.
Sorry, I think I turned into our auditor then briefly, John, but the 700 is the threshold for individual transactions and the 13.9 is the aggregate. So the 700s would add up to the 1400, but the auditors will report any errors in the papers anyway, as I recall from last year. So you'll see if there are errors, and you'll be able to make that judgment about the kind of balance of the whole, if that's any comfort to you, Councillor Kettle.
And as we understand it, you bring your judgment to bear here as well. You decide whether management action is required, albeit something might be called trivial.
Yeah. I mean, I have to consider the errors with the team and talk to the auditors about whether we adjust or not.
Yeah. So there's a lot of trust here, quite rightly, in management having a response to anything which is picked up, whether it's material or trivial, that they will use their own judgment to take appropriate action. And you will report it back to us if you have. Councillor Gifford. Yes, Councillor Feeney, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think part of the problem is the word trivial to the general public, and indeed to myself. It appears the wrong word to describe the issue. No member of the public would consider £700,000 to be trivial.
Would you prefer the word minor?
Minor, possibly, but trivial does suggest something of no importance, and clearly it is important. And in fairness to our own finance team, they would also consider it to be important. I mean, they would consider it to be important. The cases of fraud or whatever that we have occasionally had have been for substantially lower sums dramatically lower sums than the 700,000.
I think I certainly accept your point of the use of the word trivial, but I think it's a technical term, isn't it, used by auditors? What we know it means is minor, and perhaps we should explain that to the public if we're given the opportunity, or maybe you should say minor or trivial or whatever, but there is an association of the word trivial, because you shouldn't even be thinking about it or bothering about it, which is unfortunate. Andrew Felton, hand? Oh, you've got it, sorry.
Yeah. I think we probably need to draw a distinction here between what we do in terms of putting things into our final statements of accounts, because this is auditing what we do from a statement of accounts point of view, and whether we adjust or don't adjust the final accounts are reported externally. This is not about whether we are treating things as trivial at a transaction level within the organisation. I think if we had something under £700,000 that was an issue from a transactional point of view, we'd still want to fix it. If it's income or expenditure that we need to deal with, then as a finance function, we'd be dealing with that at a transactional level and an operational level anyway. So I think there's probably a need to distinguish between what we do in practice around the managing the finances of the council versus whether something's deemed material or not to adjust or account for in the final statement of accounts, depending on the point it comes out in the process of closing the accounts effectively. It's a subtle distinction between the two.
And we have Virginia. For Virginia, nothing is trivial. Is that all right? Have we answered the point?
Basically, I just wanted to reassure, this is a public meeting, and I just wanted to reassure everybody that actually the council would consider discrepancy of a few £100 to be yes. Of importance and of concern.
Yes, thank you. Councillor Feeney.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to move on to the value for money arrangements, and it's a question really probably to the external
Can you tell us
auditors.
where you're looking?
Page 28, sorry, or 12 of 20, depending which reference you're looking at. On page 28, it talks about improving economy efficiency and effectiveness. And as somebody who's been around local government for a very long time, I know I look young, but I'm not quite as young as I look. I remember the words efficiency and Gershon attached to it a while ago, and many of us were driven to finding 3% year on year of efficiency savings that, quite frankly, certainly don't exist in these lean times for local government. And I just wondered if the auditors would mind explaining what their arrangements, what their views would be around kind of efficiency savings, whether there is a set standard or whether it will be looked at as what the authority has done.
I'm sure that John will do his best to have a short answer to the question. I mean, the words efficiency, effectiveness and economy have, of course, been an unholy trio for many, many years. When I was in government, they were being talked about. That was 25 years ago. How do you balance these three?
Well, it is very much a question of balance between the three, and we would look at efficiency in the context as well of the council's overall financial position and its MTFS. I mean, personally, I don't find the sort of description of that bit of our value for money conclusion that helpful, talking about the 3 E's, but it's very much about how the council clarifies what it is trying to achieve, sets out its particular goals in those areas, and then measures performance against them, and where it identifies problems, whether they are problems in terms of outcomes, so effectiveness, or whether they're problems in terms of the costs of services, therefore the efficiency. It's about how the council then responds, what it does to put problems right, whether they are financial problems or service delivery problems. I certainly don't see this as being all about trying to squeeze in terms of efficiency. It's about the council actually achieving what it wants to achieve within the financial envelope that it's got.
Yes, that's helpful. And the external auditors are looking at the processes which we deploy. And an essential process of local government is to ensure that these 3 components of effective local government are balanced: economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Now, if you have any concerns as councillors that one of those 3 has become predominant at the expense of the others, that is your job to say, but not here to talk to the officers that we have. Then if you're doing that, then the Audit and Standards Committee knows that there's a good process in place. But that really is at the essence of at the heart of your job as councillors, to make sure that's a virtual trio and there's not a skew in the triangle. Councillor Kettle, did you have something?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I mean, in the commercial side, the value for money element of any audit is probably the only bit that company directors are really happy to pay for, to see what way that they can improve their business by having an outside review of how things are operating. Now, on page 28, the second and the third horizontal bullet point I take as read, and I'm sure the auditors carry out that. I think it's in where we talk about improving efficiency and effectiveness. Is there a benchmarking exercise whereby a firm, which I'm sure has many, many local authorities as clients, is able to reflect on best practices used in one authority and see whether, if another authority, and I'm not suggesting again that this is not, we're not doing best practice, but where there might be an opportunity if somebody has developed some new mechanism, whatever, would we get the benefit of that? And will that be, will that discussion be one which this committee will be party to? Because otherwise, it is just a box-ticking exercise, and we've
Absolutely.
got the audit, and off we go.
I'd like to move on quite soon, because Andrew Felton, do you want to say something? Just while the microphone's moving, of course, in local government, we want to be sure that all 3 of these components are being improved. Economy, effectiveness, and efficiency. You don't have to improve one at the expense of the other. However, that is the job of the officers, to do that. It is for them to benchmark. It is for them to set their own standards. It is for them to improve as much as they possibly can, under pressure from councillors, under pressure from here. What the auditors are doing is not, they want to be sure that there are arrangements in place that these things are happening, not to change the arrangements. Andrew.
You've almost said what I was going to say, John. Chair, sorry. It's incumbent on us as officers. We've got to make sure the arrangements are there for testing value for money, benchmarking, looking at whether we are securing that in the decision making that we do, either at an officer level or a member level, basically. So the auditors are testing that and to see whether our systems are robust enough to ensure that we are demonstrating that we can offer value for money. And value for money can be measured in either we are doing better than we were as an organisation in what we were spending on different services or how we're performing on different services. it can be comparative to other, but I suppose that awareness of how others are doing and whether we aspire to being that good is part of the process as well. And we're certainly looking to put that into our integrated planning process that we're driving through as a build on what we did from the MTFS last year and the corporate plan development last year through the next planning cycle as well. And there's a VFM assessment that's part of the package of information that will come at some point to one of these committees that you'll be able to see again how we assessed ourselves against the VFM test that we've got for the auditors.
And councillors have got a real role to play here. If it doesn't look right, smell right, seem right, or whatever, you go and see someone like Andrew and say, have you benchmarked this against that? In my experience, such and such. Engage, talk to them. They all got open doors. I'd like to move on, if that's all right. We're not going to touch on audit fees for the reasons said. And so I am ready to embark on item number 3, unless someone has got something they want to add or question on item 2 of the agenda. No. Item 3 is the pension fund. And again, either John or Jim, there have been a number of changes here in terms of the regulatory environment in which you're having to do an external audit. If you'd perhaps just like to touch on those again. And we're falling a little bit behind time, so if we could try and move at some pace. John.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, I don't think I need to say a great deal in relation to this plan. In terms of a sort of structure of the plan, it is very similar to the main county council audit plan. No separate value for money responsibilities in relation to our audit of the pension fund. It is just the accounts that we have to audit on the pension fund. As you mentioned, changing regulatory environments, which it's something that's kind of there in the background of our work, but doesn't have any great immediate impact on the work that we've done. Just to pick up on a couple of the things that have been talked about in discussion on the main county council audit plan. So materiality for the pension fund, rather than being based on the sort of turnover figure, is based on a percentage of the net assets of the fund. Again, that is the normal way of doing things within pension funds, because actually net assets is probably the most meaningful figure in the overall accounts of a pension fund, whereas for the county council the key figure really is how much you've spent and where's it come from. And then just to pick up on estimates, again, potentially quite a demanding role for members of this committee in terms of understanding what's going on. The key accounting estimates in relation to the audit of a pension fund are around the valuation of investments, and particularly those what we refer to as the level 3 investments in the fair value hierarchy, the ones that are harder to value. So, for example, investments in private equity and those sorts of more specialist areas where there is more scope for estimation uncertainty, and that is obviously therefore an area where we tend to have a focus. I think that's probably all I need to say by way of introduction to that plan, but again, happy to take any comments or questions, Chair.
Perhaps for new members of the committee, you'd just like to say something about the extent to which your audit is limited to Warwickshire County Council, or it looks at the interface of our pension plan with the even bigger plan of which we are a participant.
Yeah, I mean, the audit is very much focused on the fund as it operates here. Obviously, there is now investment pooling goes on, as you've mentioned. We treat the pooled investments in the same way as we would treat any other investments which are held by parties outside of the county council, essentially. So we look at the basis of the valuation, we assess the competence of whoever's actually valued it, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Chris Norton.
Just to add, when we do produce the pension fund accounts, you'll see specific lines in those accounts to do with investments that we have with the Border to Coast Pension Partnership. So that's quite explicit in the accounts, and that gives us transparency and the opportunity for you to see that and ask questions about it.
Thank you. Sarah, is this something which will be included in our training day as well?
We can certainly include that in the training day, Chair.
Thank you. And when you say you're looking at the accounting estimates, does that mean you will not be making any comment on the actuarial position? Sorry, that's for John Gregory again.
Well, I mean, the actuarial position is what it is. I mean, we will. The important thing from our point of view is the work that the actuary has actually done to come to that position. It's kind of a matter between yourselves and the actuary, if you like, what that actuarial position is and what contributions are required, and obviously that's all a well-established process.
Thank you. As I'm sure everyone's aware, when the actuaries are looking at the moment about the effects of COVID, there is a significant technical debate going on as to the extent to which COVID mortality should be included in forward projections of mortality rates. Not only that, but the extent to which the effects of COVID have had a knock-on effect of other disorders, which may in fact have been reducing people's life expectancy. And there's going to be quite a debate in the course of the next year to 18 months as to what the implications of that are on our pension fund liabilities. We may be able to touch on that in our training programme, but it's something I'm sure you all want to be sure you're properly informed on. Are there any questions on the pension fund audit plan? Councillor Gifford?
Yeah, just,
Oh,
just
got
going
one.
to make the point. Level 3 investments, the private equity particularly, Border to Coast are now putting, we are moving more that way, and Border to Coast, I think it's now 4 billion that they're putting into private equity. So it's going to be becoming increasingly difficult to value the level 3 investments. And I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Gregory, that private equity is a particularly difficult one.
And what percentage is private equity of the total investment in equities? Roughly? Chris?
It's a small percentage of the order of 5 or 10%, very small, or relatively small.
Good, thank you. Any other questions on the pension fund audit plan? Thank you. Then, if we may go on to item number 4 on our agenda, which is the audit risk assessment for Warwickshire County Council. John, I think over to you again to introduce the item.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, it may be appropriate for council officers to comment on this as well. So this document came before you at your last meeting. Those of you who've been on the committee for some time will be familiar with the basic concept of it, summarising the council's arrangements across a range of areas. It's prepared by officers for our benefit each year. I came to the last meeting of the committee, and committee made some points, suggested some changes to it, which have now been made, and I think are reflected in the revised document.
Which I'm told appear in the difference in shading. Some of you may have a colour version, which makes it easier, but if you don't have a colour version, it's in the light grey. So you see, since our last consideration, there have been a number of changes made. I don't know whether anyone wants to make any comments on the changes. Virginia.
So in the first assessment that you saw at your committee in March, there were a number of areas where we we were still working on what our accounting policies and treatments were going to be. And they were highlighted in the March report that we would update them at this committee. So things like when we had met in March, the Warwickshire Property Company hadn't been set up, so we need to put things in about that, about our estimates and our risk around that. So primarily it's things that where we have confirmed our accounting policies since the March meeting and before we finalise the accounts. There's no particular issues of concern. I think the area for you is there anything in here that doesn't chime with your understanding of the council?
Councillor Gifford.
Yes, on page 75 of the fraud risk assessment about whistleblowing, it says are you aware of any whistleblowing potential complaints, potential complaints by potential whistleblowers? If so, what has been your response? And the response is, we are aware of 2 whistleblowing complaints. One has been concluded, the second is currently being investigated. I just wondered, we don't really have an idea of how it's being concluded, or indeed any, I don't know whether it's keeping anonymity that we're not given more information, but it...
We would, of course, be pleased that the whistleblowing system appears to be working. So there is a process in place.
There is a process in place.
You're looking for an insight into the outcome of a whistleblowing complaint.
Yes, that's...
Might that...
Was it justified? Was the whistleblowing complaint upheld, or was it... it just says concluded, you know, it doesn't say any more than that. But I mean, it may be there's an anonymity issue that's...
You may or may not wish to comment.
Chair, in a public document like this, we probably wouldn't put the details of that, as you say, to respect the anonymity of those coming forward. And also, we want to encourage people to come forward and use the whistleblowing arrangements we've got in place. But I think we'll be happy to provide a little more detail outside of the meeting if you'd like more.
Yeah, this is a public meeting of which we're delighted. We have a whistleblowing system, and we had a year in which we didn't have a single complaint, and we were worried whether it was working effectively. From some points of view, we should be relieved that we not only have a system, but we have people that are using it, and matters are being concluded, matters are still under consideration. I think, to me, that's a relief. Councillor Kettle, you want to add something? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I understand again this thing. I hope we're not moving to a sphere by all these declarations that our management are making is relieving the auditors of their responsibility. This is a far more global question, and one we can't clearly answer today, but it does slightly concern me how much the onus seems to be shifting on the management, which are, you know, I'm sure are all managing all these risks. Just one, that's a point, just, I don't expect an answer on that one. But just a very minor point, there is on page 89 a typo which just slightly changed the, it could change the emphasis of point 7 as to whether the management adequate controls are management's or whether that is a question. So if at some stage that could be, I think, corrected.
Sure.
Just clarification.
We are, of course, talking about the external audit of Warwickshire County Council. We have our own processes for looking at what management is doing. That is internal audit.
Yes.
But we're not talking about that just yet. Councillor Feeney.
Thank you, Chair. On page 78, it refers to, and I'm not aware of this case, so I just wondered what the implication was. I don't know if officers or the external auditors need to explain it, but it said, we recognise that the final resolution of the McLeod pensions case is still to be determined, and I just wondered what the potential liability was to the council, or what the impact may be of that case.
I don't know if Chris would like to say something about that. Hand, could you just raise your hand, sir? Yes, that one.
Sorry, could I confirm, is that a question in respect of McLeod?
Yes.
Yes. So the actuaries have done pieces of work at the level of the whole pension fund and at the level of individual employers for the larger employers who are interested in this. Their view is that the big issue with McLeod is the administrative impact, the amount of work that admin teams have got to do to look at all the data, the actual financial implications. They're of the view that they're of a fraction of a % normally for organisations. If you're a very small organisation and you've got a particular set of employees, it could be a bigger implication, but for most big employers, including the county council, we think it's a fraction of a %.
Thank you. I mean, it's a very interesting example of how this committee works. Unless you're embedded in the pension world, you wouldn't have a clue what the McLeod case was, really. I mean, if it helps you ever, when you see something like that, feel free to ring an officer. Now you know that Chris is the man to speak to. Any concerns about pensions, ring him up. Councillor Horner. Hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. Just to comment on the McLeod case, yeah, if it's specifically limited to firefighters, it's not a big deal at all for us. But there are implications for the whole public sector in the resolution of the McLeod case. And as far as I'm aware, that's still with government. I think it came out of government, it's gone back in again. So there are, you know, I mean, the McLeod case is almost a straw man for the whole of the public sector.
Yes. Chris, I don't know if we want to add anything to that on the role of central government in terms of working towards a determination of the McLeod case.
Well, the McLeod case has got to the point where we do have the determination of how it has to work. So now we have the administration team working on implementing that in practice.
Microphone.
Thanks very much. No, the point was not the McLeod case issues. That's done and dusted. It's the issue that McLeod raises for the whole of the rest of the public sector. It's not an isolated case. It's everybody's linking into it now.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just basically, we need to be aware there might be some quite interesting times ahead on pensions.
Yes, I agree. Keeping on going on this audit risk assessment, are there any other questions or points to be made by members of the committee? Before we leave it, Sarah, did you want to bring this to a close? Right. My attention is being drawn to what we're asked to actually do here, which is that we're asked to endorse, essentially, that all these changes that have been made do reflect our views and are where we're happy to leave things, if I can find the right page. Which page are you looking at? 59. Right, so we've tried to focus on the highlighted changes, which were there, and what we have to decide is whether we're happy that having debated them and decided that we're happy to move forward. Can everyone nod in assent to that? Yes, okay, thank you. We will move now on to the SIPFA Financial Management Code, which you will see is also put self-assessment. So having had a code and having read our homework and having examined ourselves, we've now marked our homework and we appear to have 10 out of 10. Now, this may or may not encourage you as to how well things are working, but I think it would be useful for us to hear about how we ended up assessing ourselves in this way. So perhaps, Andrew, if you'd like to start off. And I think that perhaps Virginia can also say some things because you have had some checks and balances in place. So could we ask you to speak to it first?
Yeah, Virginia and her team have done all the work on this, so and alongside the rest of the finance. So there's a combined effort that we've shared this in the organisation to see how we're performing against the standard. And we felt that it was best practice to share this with the committee to get your views, visibility of this within the organisation. Obviously, we're tested on that by the external auditors as part of their processes as well. An internal auditor, obviously, through the work they do in the annual audit plan, are constantly checking against whether we're conforming to the standards that we set ourselves. Being relatively new to the organisation, still only a year or so into my tenure here, my observation of the team I've inherited and the work they're doing is that really solid, really stable, really good processes in practice. And that's what's reflected within the self-assessment that's been done and the information that's come out. That doesn't mean to say there isn't room for improvement. So again, we've tried to be realistic and transparent in the things that we feel we can still push on with to further improve where we are at this stage. Because it's not just about being okay, it's about being as good as we can be as a finance function, as an organisation around our financial management. And there's a lot of, this code effectively is something that as a professional accountant and my team as predominantly professional accountants have to conform to, set the benchmark for how we should be performing to offer good financial management to you, the people of Warwickshire, the people who use our services effectively. So it's really important that we are showing that good level and standard of behaviour and governance and delivery of our financial processes. And that's all what's reflected in here. There's no material areas of concern. The internal audit opinions that we have on the majority of our systems reflect that as well, that obviously you see on an ongoing basis as we go through an annual cycle of those. So I think, yeah, it does look, everything's green, but there's still room for improvement that we've recognised in terms of taking us to that next level as a finance function there.
And you know that we don't like you marking your own homework, so you've had some checks in place, so yes. Perhaps you could talk about those.
But Virginia, as I say, Virginia and her team have done the work on this, so she may want to say something about the detail around it.
Then let's let Virginia speak for herself. Virginia, please.
So yes, to complete this assessment, we did the initial assessment in me and my team, and then we circulated it across senior managers across the finance service. We also entered into discussions with other local authorities about things they were doing to meet the standards, to check that there was nothing we were missing. We also looked at some of the assessments from other authorities that had already been to their audit and standards committees or their equivalent of, with the documents to check to see where we were. And actually I think we were doing, if I'm being honest, I think we were doing quite well relative to some of the other ones that we've seen in terms of the level of detail and the level of understanding. So I think it's been through a process of assessment and challenge across the finance community and wider. But we do work on a basis of continuous improvement, and therefore there will always be things we can do better, because the CIPFA standards that we are professionally required to comply with are minimum standards. They're not saying, by saying green, we're not saying we're perfect. We're saying we comply with the minimum standards that we're required to meet. But there are things we can do, and we are using other authorities as a benchmark to check what they're doing as well as part of that process, as well as an internal challenge.
And as I read it, there are about 20 areas where you think there are some things you could do to make things even better. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Yeah. And those are all things that are already underway and in train. They're not things... And I suppose what's really positive is they were things that we had already put in train before we did the assessment. So actually we'd already, through our normal work, decided these were the things we wanted to improve as part of our process of continuous improvement. They just happened to fit in with the assessment. So I think that's for me, that was the really strong point of this, that the things where we could identify things to improve when we looked ourselves against the assessment were things that we'd already identified internally that where we could improve.
I mean, that's hugely reassuring. Does anyone have any points to add on that? I mean, it just shows that marking your own homework can work, as long as you don't do it on your own. And I think the important thing that Virginia has shared with us is that this has been a team exercise in which they've worked together to develop areas for improvement. Are there any questions or points to be made further then on the self-assessment? Councillor Kettle?
Yes. Do the auditors, at the end of the audit, report on this statement as to whether they are comfortable with the points made going forward as an independent verification of it?
I am sure the external auditors will bear in mind the fact that we've been through this exercise, but John Gregory might wish to... Oh, Andrew, you going to come first?
Sorry, yeah. If that's all right,
Okay,
Chair.
Andrew first and then John Gregory afterwards.
This self-assessment isn't something that forms part of the formal external audit. It's something that the auditors will find quite useful, and I'm sure they'll pay attention to it and find it interesting. But they will assess us based on the criteria they've got around the closure of accounts and the other things they do. Internal audit will be testing us on some of our internal controls in terms of whether we're conforming to some of the processes that are within the code. So it's a mix of the internal and external audits that we have that will give us some assessment as to whether the external view is that we are as good as we feel we are from the internal perspective, if that makes sense.
And I'm sure it won't be a surprise for people to hear that there are a number of local authorities which are nothing like as diligent in this area as we do, of what are called critical self-examination, and using that to be the basis of our improvement plans for the years ahead. We are well served by Warwickshire in this regard.
Just if I could, Chair, just to I'm mic'd already, just to add to what Andy said and confirm really, no, it's not something that we have a specific requirement to audit, but it is useful sort of background information to us, both in terms of the sort of content and substance of it, and also the very fact that officers have been through this process and been through this process diligently gives us some assurance about the way the place is run, which both contributes to our sort of view of the degree of risk in relation to the accounts audit, and also informs the sort of governance strand of the value for money assessment.
I think this is the first year we've done this, isn't it? So this is a little bit experimental. But to pick up one of your earlier points, Councillor Kettle, one of the things which you will see is that we want to have a more comprehensive approach to the use of benchmarking information. Now, benchmarking is an incredibly big area, though. If you think of the scope to benchmark in a local authority, it's absolutely huge. And I suspect that what we will be revisiting as an Audit and Standards Committee in the months or the years ahead is, has the local authority focused on the areas where benchmarking is likely to bring the greatest benefits in economy, efficiency, etc. But it is a new area, and I think if there's one lesson for us all, it is that we should look at all the planned developments which have arisen from this work, and there are many of them, and ask ourselves, well, which are we the most interested in? I have to say that some which look really tasty, others I'd happily defer for a year. Fine. Is it okay to move on from item 5 and go on to item 6, which is the annual governance statement? And this report begins on page 121. With annual governance statement, sometimes called AGS, and I think Chris Norton is going to lead us through this. We are going to be asked whether we believe that this draft annual governance statement should be submitted now to the external auditors.
Yeah, so this is a statutory annual report. It goes alongside the annual accounts. I'll just do a brief introduction and then take comments, and hopefully I'll address the marking your own homework question in doing so. So this draft has been considered by officers, including a dedicated AGS panel that was set up to look at it specifically. It's been reported to corporate board, and it's been considered by people including the monitoring officer, the AD Finance and Section 151 officer. In terms of the key features of the report, there's an element of the report that refers to the SITFA principles of good governance. We've set up a new corporate, or an updated corporate code of governance that now considers those things in terms of the business as usual aspects. So those have been taken out of this AGS report and are cross-referenced by it. So at the last Audit and Standards Committee meeting, you will have seen that other report. Instead, what this AGS report does is it focuses on this year, and it focuses on those 7 principles and what we've done in respect of COVID. So that's one of the significant features of the report in Section 3. Section 4 details improvements that we've made through the year, so despite COVID, there have been a number of improvements and changes that have been made. For example, we've introduced a new risk management framework, and there have been updates in respect of changed portfolio governance. Section 5 details the challenges we faced and risks. There have been no significant governance failures identified, and there's nothing of that nature to report. This statement would be passed on to the auditors following this meeting, and it will become part of our published, publicly available accounts in due course. The only other thing to add is that assistant directors have signed off assurance statements talking about how in their particular areas of the council they're content with the application of controls in those areas, so we have those in place as well. That's all I had to say by way of introduction. Happy to take comments or questions.
Of course, the thing which distinguishes Warwickshire County Council too is that we are one of the few local authorities that has statutory responsibility for its fire and rescue service. And so I always look to make sure that there is a proper statement about our responsibilities there in the governance statement, and you will see that there is. That appears on, I can't remember where it is, but certainly it is specifically referred to. But if I could put to the committee, does anyone have any questions about the annual governance statement? Or about where COVID appears? Councillor Gifford, we start with you, please.
Yes, on page 145, it talks about the continuing pressure of special educational needs, and I think they're absolutely right to see it as a real challenge at the moment. And one of the, if you go to page 146, you'll see that the opening of a new special school is one of the means that's hopefully going to produce better value for money, and I mean, I just hopefully, generally a better educational experience for those with special educational needs.
Good governance response.
Yeah.
The need. Yeah.
And I just sort of, it looks good to me, but it is.
And are all councillors aware of this, or is this the first time this has appeared? You weren't aware of it before you saw it here? Well, that's... Councillor. You have been made aware of it? You had, okay. Good. Yes, I agree, Councillor Gifford. Most encouraging. Are there any questions or points then on the governance statement, or questions for Chris? Councillor Feeney, please.
Yes, there isn't a mention in here about the pressures of adult social care, and I just wondered whether officers, whether you only got like to pick 5, or whether that we felt that we were addressing the significant pressures in adult social care well, I suppose is the question.
Andrew Felton. If you could raise your hands a little higher, because from behind you it's sometimes difficult to see.
Sorry, Chair. Within our medium-term financial plans, there's obviously a lot of allowance for the demand pressures that we see within adult social care, and obviously a lot of that's partly why we are raising the additional money through the adult social care precept as well. So there is a recognition that there is pressure there, but we don't see that as a key risk for us because we feel it's well managed, it's under control, and we don't have some of the issues that you see in other local authorities where adults is a real pressure point that's creating uncertainty around that future. There are still challenges, don't get me wrong, but it's not as big as it is in some of the other areas that are referenced within the report as key risks for us as the authority. Is probably the best way to position it.
Thank you. And are councillors all aware of the COVID recovery plan and all the things that it embraces? Good. Thank you. Are there any other questions on the governance statement? No, thank you, Chris. It's an excellent piece of work. Let's move on to item number 7, if we may, which is the internal audit annual report, which begins at page 153. Paul Clark will introduce this. Thank you, Paul.
So this annual report is really the report that looks back at the work of internal audit over the last year for 2020-21 and provides the head of audit's annual opinion on the governance, risk and control environment for the county council. 2020-21 was a difficult year
You haven't been turned off, have you?
No, I'm still here. I'm just waiting for the phone. It was a difficult year, certainly at the start of the year, heavily impacted by COVID, and so the work of the internal audit team was impacted in the first quarter. But we brought to the committee an audit plan which reflected the overall risks facing the council and a plan of work which has largely been completed, and the outcomes of the internal audit works set out in the appendix on page 164. There was a greater element of advice work given by the team during the year, acting as a critical friend around areas of COVID impact, and also some of the key work of the council, including the property company work that's been going on, and advice to support that. And that's given us an insight into the working of the council, even in areas where we've not undertaken specific audits and produced a specific opinion. We've also been able to take account of assurances from other work that's been undertaken by other bodies on behalf of the council. So for example, on risk management, there's been a significant piece of work undertaken this year on risk management, and that was supported by external support, and we regard that as a positive in terms of the moving the council forward on risk management. And so it's really, this report brings together my opinion based on all the information available, the work we've undertaken. When you look at the balance of the audit opinions that have come out from the work undertaken on page 158, there's a pie chart there, and you see that the majority of those opinions, 55%, were in the moderate assurance category. Compared with the previous year in 2019-20, the proportion of limited assurances has reduced this year, which is positive, but overall the majority are in that moderate assurance category, which is a positive assurance, obviously not as strong as a substantial assurance, but we're able to give a moderate assurance opinion at the end of the year, and that's where the conclusion comes to on the page 163. I'm happy to take any questions on the report, Chair.
Yes, thank you. And of course, even though you don't cover it in the commentaries, the full summary of your audits completed during the year is in Appendix A, which is very reassuring. And we will refer back to that when we look at our own annual report. So are there any questions for internal audit? Councillor Gifford, please.
Yes, as Paul was stating, it's a look back, obviously, over the past year. There are two limited ones, pension administration, which I feel quite a lot of work has been done on over the past year. And certainly I got the impression that staff and pensions as a committee has certainly strengthened its oversight of the pensions element within staff and pensions. The other one is strategic property, and I would hope that with a strong property company that will move. There's a danger that it could be more risk, but it also could. I'm certainly impressed with the quality of the people we seem to be appointing at the top, so I would hope that that would be able to move up in due course. It is, of course, always historic when looking at this.
I think Rob Powell might like to comment on that.
Thank you. And yeah, I mean, both of those two audits are very old. Their work that took place, I think, 2 years ago or something like that, Paul. You're absolutely right, Councillor Gifford, on pensions administration. We did have some work to do, as reflected in the limited assurance, and I think our pension administration is unrecognisable from the position 2 years ago. Similarly, strategic property is a pretty dated report now. We've restructured, we're creating the property company. There's more to do, but they are relatively historical findings. We are going to, this is not an issue with the internal audit team, but we are going to put the pressure on managers to respond in a more timely way to audits to avoid this in future years. Yeah, they are issues that we've had in the past that we've tackled in different ways. Still work to do, but I would like to think they would get a much better finding now.
Yes, thank you, and we hope that you will continue to use the consideration that we're giving matters to say there is continuing concern in this area and ongoing scope for improvement. Thank you. Are there any other questions? So are people happy with that in a very difficult year? I think we have to say, Paul, doing your job under COVID circumstances is incredibly difficult. We know how difficult it is to have friendly meetings by Zoom when you have to cross-examine people and probe things into some detail. Very difficult by Zoom. So if you could thank your team for all that's been done on our behalf. You are working on our behalf. Thank you. Good. Let's move on to item number 8 then, which is the annual report of this committee, which we make to full council. If I could perhaps take a few items. Well, one of the matters which you will note is that we lost our second independent member of this committee some time ago and have been out to recruit, but as yet have not been successful in having any applicants. And it has been quite rightly put that, well, perhaps the fact that there is an experienced chairman is an obstacle. Should it be your wish, I'm happy to stand down and reapply, really, because then you'd have the chance both of advertising for a chairman and a second independent member, and as a device that has been used in other places. Councillor Horner.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chairman. Just to comment on your proposal to stand down, I think it would be fair to say, for those of us who've been on this committee a few years, that we'd be completely lost without you.
Well, that's very kind, and it may be true, but we still do need to recruit another independent member. And one way to, in fact, get a better quality of field is you may get 5 or 6 applicants for chairman, and I could assure you that I would reapply. But we might at the same time get some very interesting candidates as the second independent member. So it is a practical suggestion. Councillor Gifford.
Yes, I mean, I basically use you as an example of how someone should chair a meeting and keep it to time and keep us on board and keep us focused on the right items, and generally I'd be worried if you were to stand down. I'd take your point about reapplying, but I would be concerned. I think you do an extremely good job, And I'm not just saying that to try and flatter you and get favourable attention.
Right, well, thank you. I think we've ventilated that. We'll just have to keep trying. Fine, that was on page 1 of our annual report. Let us move on. That says what we did. That talks about our role with external audit. It talks about our focus on reaction to COVID-19, and we mustn't forget our reactions to the likely outcome of the exit from the EU, and we wanted to be sure that certain things which might otherwise have been missed were covered, like, for example, animal welfare. Did I see animal welfare anyway? It was included, yes. Saying that, mindful of the fact that Arbid of Warwickshire is very much an agricultural county. You will also see on page 4 there were certain specific areas which we wanted to be sure that people knew we'd looked at. The Fire and Rescue Service is in there, as indeed is safeguarding. You will have looked, of course, to see whether safeguarding appeared in the summary of audits completed during the year. Well, in fact, even though we attended to it, it had been completed in the previous year. But it is an area on which we have a watching brief. There's another area which I think should probably come under our work programme, and that's the overall approach in the county to case management, which relates to both adult and child social care. And I think we look to ourselves as being guardians of good practice in that area. We will revisit it. The Code of Conduct we talk about, the Government of Change programme, looking ahead, do any of the members of the committee in the past feel there's something we've left out or misrepresented? No, you're happy with that? Everyone happy? So are we happy then that that does represent a fair report of the work of this committee over our past year? Thank you. Right. The next item on the agenda is our future work programme and future meeting dates, which appears on page 175. You will see there the matters which we considered at this meeting and the matters which we're planning to discuss at the next meeting, scheduled for the 24th of September. If there's anything further which people would like us to talk about, do please get in touch with John Cole, who provides our secretarial service. He and I will talk about it to make sure it can be dealt with properly, and we'll obviously consult with officers to make sure they've got time to respond. Is there anything anyone at this point would like to add to our future work programme, or does that look useful? It does. And hopefully those dates can go in your diary. I'd like to conclude then with, at this part of the meeting, with is there any other business? And I will go around our table. Councillor Birdie, do you have any other business you wish to bring to our attention? Councillor Horner? Councillor Feeney? Councillor Gifford? Councillor Kettle? Thank you very much. Then that brings to an end the public proceedings of the Audit and Standards Committee. So would someone like to propose we move into a private session? Thank you, Councillor Horner. Seconded. Thank you, Councillor Kettle. Then we will have a short adjournment while we make the necessary broadcast arrangements, or debroadcast arrangements, whatever the verb is. And then when I'm told we're ready, we will move into our private session.